Hello, this is Tom with Tabletop Tap Room. We're picking up our Rediscovering First Edition AD&D, and we're looking at magic swords. I was kind of feeling like I wasn't going to go into every category of magic items in the DMG, and I was going to gloss over swords. I was going to gloss over armor. But, Joe the Lawyer inspired me. Joe the Lawyer is a vlogger on YouTube, and he did a video on high ego, high intelligence magic swords, why you should use it in your campaign, which kind of, it very much Joe the Lawyer speak boiled down to, because it can screw with the players. And it was a great video. I absolutely, I loved it. I enjoyed it. And it inspired me to, all right, let's dig into the nuts and bolts of high intelligence magic swords, because ultimately most of the swords, a +1 sword, a +2 sword, it just is. But when you start adding the high intelligence and ego to a sword, and it's able to communicate telepathically or through languages that actually speaks, then it starts to get a little bit more interesting. When they've got powers and abilities that are for the pursuit of their stated goal, their mission that the sword has. So it kind of dovetails on what we saw with the Lord of the Rings, with the One Ring. It had a goal, and its goal was to get back to its master. And so it was using Gollum, it was using Bilbo, it was using Frodo, and it was going from person to person to person to person. And and it had effects, and magic swords can have effects. And so this is actually a much more interesting than I first thought category. And mostly it was Joe the Lawyer that lit the torch and paved the path, because he introduced one to his campaign to screw with his players. So shout out to Joe the Lawyer. I'll put a link in the show notes for his YouTube vlog. Check it out. Well worth it. Great guy. Now, before we get too deep, let me just say thanks for watching the video. Thanks to my subscribers. You guys are great. And don't forget that like, subscribe, and bell icon to help me build the channel. Now, looking at AD&D, and I'm going to be comparing it to Expert, the Moldvay Cook Expert rules, because they came out at the same time. And so it's the same thinking went into this idea of magic swords. And there's some interesting contrast there. For instance, in AD&D, magic swords run the gamut of +1 through +5. But in Expert D&D, it's +1 through +3. Now, there's a lot of interesting +1 in Expert, +1, but +3 against undead, +3 against dragon, where it's kind of like a special category. And there's a lot of those in Expert, but Expert loses out on the really oddball stuff you get in AD&D, like the Holy Avenger, the Vorpal Sword, the Sword of Sharpness, Sword of Life Stealing. These are really interesting swords, and certainly with a lot of potential to massively affect the campaign. Use caution when introducing them, particularly if the campaign is a little bit on the low level side. AD&D is not so mapped out in how you build a magic sword. It provides the tables. You're supposed to be smart enough to just roll on the tables and figure it out. But BX is a little bit more what my father called idiot proofing. They have a recipe. Step 1, step 2, step 3. And so BX is a little bit more basic player, introductory to D&D. Let's walk you through this. Whereas AD&D is like, yeah, here's the tables. Go ahead and roll. So a little bit more of Gygax's style that you see in the AD&D books comes out there. Now, let's look at the different categories that delineate a high intelligence sword, because ultimately the Holy Avenger, a +1 sword, +3 versus dragons, You just read the description. You don't need much explanation. I feel, unless you're like you got questions, you put them in the show notes, maybe, I guess. But let's look at the special categories that go into the delineating a high intelligence, high ego sword. What I say high. That's a little bit of the influence of Joe the lawyer. He didn't introduce a sword that was low intelligence. He introduced one that was high intelligence, high ego. So I shouldn't say that. It's just an intelligent sword, which will have an ego, which will have a personality challenge if circumstances come out right, versus the players. So special purpose in AD&D, it's heavily the intelligent swords are heavily weighted towards slaying a character class. I don't really like this per se, unless it's the big bad evil guy. Special, an intelligent sword with the special purpose of slaying thieves. Ooh, I could actually see a special purpose sword, and it's being to slay magic users, to slay illusionists, just make it any spellcaster, not a cleric, not a cleric druid. So you just cover everybody there. Yeah. So that table is so weighted towards all the different character classes. I really feel like it should be different things like dragons, undead, character class, and then you roll on a sub table. And so you could end up with one that still slaying thieves or slaying assassins or slaying magic users or fighters or paladins or whatever have you. You could still have that, but only make it one. So that would require a house rule modification on your part. I think then it works okay. I just don't like how heavy it is slated towards the character classes. Demons and devils should be in there too. I could see we're making this magic sword to slay devils or to slay demons. That would be something I could see a cabal of magic users and priests getting together and going, yes, we must create this for the paladin who's going to invade hell for us and set things right. Yeah, you do have to modify the table, I feel. Special purpose sword is used when it's used for a special purpose. The sword and expert gains a specific ability according to its alignment. I have a screenshot. Let me throw that up here. And so the rules give a very specific, and of course, this harkens back to the fact that expert is a 3-point alignment system, not a 9-point alignment system. And that's one of the major differences here between the two systems with intelligent swords. But you gain a very specific ability that only functions when the sword's being used for its special purpose in expert. AD&D has a larger 7-item special purpose power table, which is much more random. And so it's a much more random type of thing. You could get some oddball results that may not feel so organic, like they match with the special purpose. I would actually, if I was a magic user, if I were a rich man, if I were a dungeon master putting an intelligent sword into my campaign, yes, I like Fiddler on the Roof. I would actually maybe pick the powers. I would pick the things and not roll it so random, but you certainly can. So that's special purpose. AD&D, again, is a much more random table, whereas expert is it's by alignment. This is the power you get. Now, intelligence and language. I'm going to handle these two features together because intelligence determines languages or how it communicates. The lowest intelligence possible communicates by empathy. So then you have to describe vague feelings and urges, and so you got to be a little more creative with that telepathy is a little more straightforward, and then, of course, a high intelligence sword is going to have a bunch of languages. So AD&D swords are smarter than BX swords, but the smartest BX sword can automatically read magic. That's one of the big differences. There's a slight chance for AD&D swords to speak more languages than a BX sword. So that's the kind of breakdown. Now, the higher intelligence for AD&D swords, I really think that's just a feature of the fact of how the contest of wills goes on. And so the way the formula works in the two systems is a little different. And I think that's why the AD&D swords are just slight. So I wouldn't necessarily take an intelligent BX sword and port it right over unless you're okay with the fact that it's not going to be quite as smart as other AD&D intelligent swords. Alignment. I already alluded to it. 9-point alignment system for one system and a 3-point alignment. AD&D, of course, has the 9-point alignment. And there's a slight chance on swords with neutral in their alignment that you don't have to be the same exact alignment, but the penalty for holding the wrong alignment, sword can be a little bit bad, so it's BX with the 3-point alignment system is a little more forgiving. So with BX, it basically, like, if you're lawful and the sword is chaos, it's more damage. But if you're lawful and the sword is neutral, then it's less damage. So it's like, I think it's D6 versus 2D6 if you're 2 points away on the alignment system in BX. So it's actually, and I remember back in the day, we always went, I'm neutral. We didn't want to be goody two shoes, but we didn't want to be evil. So I'm neutral. I could go either way. And so that was probably a benefit back in the day. I mean, nowadays I would just go ahead and play, no, I'm lawful, or I'm, chaotic good, or neutral good, or lawful good. I would just go ahead and play good because I want to. But back in the day, we always played neutral. So that was a benefit on the BX thing. Although I don't think it ever came up in our games. So personally, I would scrap the AD&D alignment usage for the sword and just use the BX version of it, that the sword is good, the sword is neutral, or the sword is evil. And if you're good, then you can use a good sword. And if you're neutral, you can use a neutral sword. And if you're evil, I would do it that way because, I mean, we're talking 9-point alignment system. And if the wrong sword turns up in the campaign, or the game master's like, this sword is for so-and-so, I made it the exact alignment of the character, then it feels a little bit, I don't know. I would prefer to scrap the whole alignment system the way it's done in AD&D and just make it very similar to how it's done in BX. I think that would be much better. And I would use the damage rules for BX for considering good, neutral, evil handling of a sword in AD&D. Basically, if you're 1 point off, 1d6 damage for picking up the wrong alignment sword. And if you're 2 points off, 2d6 damage. Primary powers. The list have some differences, but they're essentially the same between the two systems. These are primary powers that you get to use. You have extraordinary powers, essentially the same situation as primary. That it's just a random list of powers, slight differences between the two systems. Ego. AD&D ego. AD&D determines ego by a formula of how much power the sword has. Expert determines it on a random roll. So, a Holy Avenger or a Vorpal sword, or something with a high +5 to it, it's you start getting an ego score that's quite high. that meshes with the high intelligence, and then you've got a contest of wills to take over the player character if the sword does not approve of what the player character is doing. Like, there is an opportunity for the sword to pursue its primary mission, its special purpose, and the player is not going along. Oh, we got a contest of wills, and now the sword is going to force them to do it. With expert, it's just a simple, rather than have it be a complicated formula, they made it a random roll. So that's kind of a big difference. I like the idea that a more powerful sword is going to have a stronger ego. And I would hate to see a +1 sword with a high ego taking over my player character. Be like, all this for a +1 on the attack roll. This is not fun. But I mean, if you've got something really fascinating, really powerful, and every once in a while it takes you over and forces you to follow a particular, it's like, I know there's an ogre in this dungeon and my purpose is to slay ogres. We're going to go get that ogre. Even though you want to bypass the ogre and just get to the treasure, and the sword's like, screw the treasure, we're going to get that guy. That to me would be much more fun. So will of sword versus character. They're essentially calculated the same, and both have provisions for loss of hit points, giving the sword the upper hand. So as the player has lost hit points in both systems, there's provisions there that you're weaker, you're knocked down, and now the sword is like, test of wills. My ego and intelligence are trying to overpower you and bend you to my will. AD&D is more detailed about the commands of the sword. So if you're playing expert, or even if you're playing an OSR clone and using this, the AD&D book, if you don't have it, get a PDF. They're easy to find out there on the web. Much more detailed than what the demands of the sword will be, in that it might assert the demand, and if you don't go along with it, then it becomes a contest of wills. So then it becomes a little back and forth between the player and the sword. And maybe the player is thinking like, I've lost some hit. I'm down by half. I'm down by more than half. I don't need a test of wills. So I'm going to do what the sword says this time. Expert is much more simplified, and it's list of demands. Now, the idea of a intelligent sword taking over a character is actually what led me to do the video on lycanthropes. I wanted to say something in this video about AD&D having a lot of mechanisms for you just lose control of your character. And there are cursed items that do that. There's lycanthropy. You can end up an NPC if you don't get the lycanthropy healed. Magic swords with a high intelligence, high ego can certainly take over your character. Very briefly, though. It's not permanent like lycanthropy, but it's a very temporary thing. So there were all these mechanisms. Death was another mechanism by which you lose control of your character. That one's pretty permanent. You're dead. Unless you're reincarnated or unless you're resurrected through the various spells available. Even reincarnation, the spell, bringing a character back, is a partial loss of control of the player character, because the player character could come back not as a level 9 fighter. He could come back as a kobold. He could come back as an orc. This is just yet one more mechanism for challenging the player. You could lose control of your character. What are you going to do about this? Are you going to keep the sword? Are you going to use the sword? Are you going to let the sword challenge your character because the sword's actually smarter than you? So maybe not you, the player, but certainly smarter than your fighter, where you used intelligence as a dump stat. Now, while working on this, some ideas jumped out at me from the DMG. Now, admittedly, I'm going to take a few liberties. You got to house rule a few things here to do what I'm about to propose. But imagine an intelligent sword that speaks a maximum number of languages. So that would be 2 rolls on the AD&D table. you could simply pick 7 to 8 languages. So this is an intelligent sword, and it's got the maximum number of languages, which it could be a lower intelligence sword. It doesn't have to be a high intelligent sword with a high risk of contest of wills, because in AD&D you're rolling randomly on the table. So you've got 7 to 8 languages, and as its purpose is to end war. Its purpose is to end war through diplomacy, such that it gives a +3 bonus on a diplomacy or a charisma check for the purpose of diplomacy, not for all purposes. Otherwise, the players will be doing they'll be using that +3 bonus to to negotiate the price of a wagon or something. I mean, they'll be using it all the time, and I think that would be a little unbalanced. But for the purposes of and the sword, if like goblins are losing or are weaker than the party, and the goblins offer to parlay, the sword would be a little pissed off if you don't take up the opportunity to parlay. Some players would be like, no, just kill the goblins. We don't want them at our back. We don't want to have to deal with these guys again. And the sword would be like, whoa, sorry, you're violating my purpose. Now you got a contest to wills, or the sword's not allowing you to use some of its powers. So to ensure the illusion that the character bearing the sword is the diplomat, one of the abilities of the sword could be it has a limited illusion ability. That's taken right from the list of abilities. So you give it a limited illusion ability, and it appears as if the voice is coming from the person who carries the sword, and it looks like they're actually talking. So the illusion's very, very limited, and it's part of this whole purpose of diplomacy and ending war, because the sword will tell you its purpose is to end war, and then it's going to be beaten into a plowshare. Now that's a verse that appears in the Old Testament and the New Testament of the Christian Bible, the Jewish Bible. But we don't have Christianity in D&D, right? I would go ahead and use it anyways, because who is your audience? Your audience is the players. And chances are the players are very familiar with Christianity or Judaism or the Judeo-Christian ethic. They've heard this phrase of beating swords into plowshares or beating plowshares into swords, because it's a biblical phrase. It comes out of that book. I would go ahead and use it just because it sounds cool. People will recognize it. And so it's a mission of this sword. And so this sword is a sword for diplomacy. And its name might be something like the Sword of Peace, or the Plowshare. I kind of like the Plowshare. Or Polyglot, because it speaks so many languages. And its goal is to put an end to all war, and it does that through diplomacy. But when diplomacy fails, it's still a +1 sword. So as for the alignment, what other alignment would a sword have than true neutral? This sword, its mission is to end war, and it wants to do diplomacy. It's true neutral. It's got to be true neutral. What if the players are trying to take down a dragon? The dragon does a lore check and recognizes the sword and says, "Parlay." The players have to stop fighting, or the sword's going to work against them. That would be the very definition of time to screw with the players. AKA Joe the lawyer. Thank you very much. So that's what I would do. A simple sword, +1 sword, but it's got a +3 if you're doing diplomacy checks. You're trying to end war, because that's its mission. It's got all these languages. That's certainly a benefit if you don't have all those languages. And it makes the fighter or dwarf or whoever happens to be carrying that sword look good. Look like that they are this genius at diplomacy, because the sounds coming out of their mouth, everybody believes it's their voice, and it looks like the person is doing the talking when the sword is doing the talking. So that's what I would do with a intelligent high ego, and I might not even make this sword very intelligent and high ego, but it would sulk. So if it can't do a test of wills, it might just turn off powers, and then just too bad, because you're pissing the sword off, and you got to live with that now. So this is Tom for Tabletop Tap Room. Thanks for watching the video. Thanks for enjoying the first edition AD&D Rediscovered series, and keep on gaming.